Thank you for joining me for the last day of the discussion of the book of Ezekiel, day 252, for Tuesday, September 8th, 2020, focusing on Ezekiel chapters 47 through 48. The book of Ezekiel began with images against Israel, and at the end it concludes with images of a restored Israel, the 12 tribes. In Ezekiel 47, we see an image of flowing water with the temple of the Lord as its life-giving source. In verse 1, "Then he brought me back to the entrance of the temple. There, water was flowing from behind the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced the east, and the water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar." So Ezekiel goes and follows the water and sees what's happening with the water pouring down from Jerusalem, or this temple of the Lord in his image, as he is there in this image of him in the temple of the Lord around Jerusalem, or the holy city. Anyways, the idea is that the water is flowing down from the high places to a lower place. And in verse 12, on the banks on both sides there was a river, and there was growing all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. This is going to sound very familiar to the book of Revelation, where we have the image of a garden at the end of the book of Revelation. This idea that when God comes, and in God's beatific vision for the future, that the life-sustaining source of God and the sanctuary, God's word and water, all kind of flows and mingles in together, and that God will be our constant source of life. Now the chapter closes with new boundaries for dividing the land among the tribes, and that's laid out in chapter 48, the divisions of the tribes. Now, 7 names are given in the first 7 chapters. Dan, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Ephraim, Reuben, and Judah are given. These are given as the 7 northernmost tribes there of the tribes of Israel. In fact, that will be completed down in verse 23. We'll have the southern 5 tribes there referenced. What's significant for me is the break in between. It breaks right after Judah. It could have had 6 tribes and 6 tribes, but it stops there with Judah and stops to talk about the temple of the Lord. Does this mean that really the tribe of Judah is the focal point of this story? Maybe so. Who knows? But in the holy sector, the Levites are given an allotment for their purposes. Additionally, the prince, as we referenced last time, is given an allotment too. So, as it's sandwiched with the 7 tribes and Judah, and then talks about the temple of the Lord, then we have the concluding 5 tribes of Benjamin, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, and Gad are discussed in verse 23 in their allotment. And finally, in closing, the renewed city will have its heritage in mind. This new Jerusalem will be a place for connecting the 12 tribes of Israel to God. And as a model to this, a testament, the city will have 12 gates. 3 will be facing each cardinal direction. 3 in the north, 3 in the south, 3 in the west, 3 in the east. And these 3 gates will represent, these 3 in each direction will combine for 12 gates, 1 representing each of the 12 tribes. And so the idea that I get is that one comes into the city of God through one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so this theological statement, very much connected with, God's people going back to Moses, and the 12 tribes of Israel being, a very important theme in the Old Testament for sure. But the idea of that is how salvation comes, is through inclusion in God's community, to be a chosen member of God's beloved community, and to follow the practices of this unique community with all their rituals. In verse 35, the last concluding thought for the book of Ezekiel, the circumference of the city shall be 18,000 cubits, and the name of the city from that time on shall be, the Lord is there. So the idea is that the Lord promised to leave, and Ezekiel, at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, saw God's spirit and presence removed from Jerusalem for all of the sins, all of the corruption, the impurity, the injustices that were happening there in Jerusalem. God removed God's presence, and they were sacked by Babylon. But the idea is that God will not remove God's presence forever, and that in fact God had been wanting to be close by, and that hopefully with a restored sense of love and worship, following in God's ways, and through the proper sacrifices, that God's community will be in fact able to be a holy community set apart from all the other nations of the earth, and that people will want to come in through the 12 tribes to become a Jew and become part of God's chosen and beloved community. So, or Israelite, I should say. I don't know how, I don't know at this moment in time how important it or central it is to be a Jew specifically, but Israelite for sure, I should say. We'll talk more about all of that development there in the New Testament, but at this moment in time, this concludes the book of Ezekiel. So thanks for journeying with me, and may God always be there for you.